Hello, everyone, and welcome to your first class in UF 100, the Anthropology of Cooking and Eating. This is the class where we get to answer one big question from multiple perspectives, and that is, what is food? How does our conception of food affect what and how we cook and eat? So anthropology is a study of people, and it uses the past and present to understand our diversity of behavior, biology, and culture. And food is an excellent topic to explore how humans vary and how we're the same. People are such extreme omnivores that we could survive on totally different diets in different places, consuming none of the same ingredients. So humans have fundamental nutrition needs, but we are very flexible in the ways that we meet them in procuring, producing, cooking, and eating food. This lecture will give you a little bit of an overview of how we're going to answer this question throughout the class and how we can combine using critical inquiry and new knowledge to answer our question. So this is a big question, and big questions often come with big answers that are not easily understood. You could answer this question simply, what is food, by referring to the U.S. Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that defines food for people in the U.S., and this means that food is articles used for food or drink for people or other animals, chewing gum, and articles used for components of any such article. So basically, the government defines food as food, anything that's used for food or part of a food. And chewing gum is an interesting example. We're going to have a guest lecture by an attorney, and he'll talk about whether swallowing makes up a piece of food or not. But you can think a little bit critically right off the bat about this definition. Does it match the common sense definition of what is food? Just because something's edible, does that mean that it is food? Do you personally eat anything that's edible? What about things that are edible but not used as food? And what about food items that are used for non-food purposes? This definition might be good enough for purposes of regulating food, but does it ultimately affect how we cook and eat? And you can ask yourself some of these questions as we go, and think about some of the things you've eaten. Have you eaten tree bark? Well, maybe you have, if it's cinnamon. Have you eaten bacteria? Maybe you have, if it's cheese. Have you eaten songbird? Maybe you have, if you're French and you have a love of the ortolan bunting, a nearly extinct songbird in France, because of it's a delicacy in the way you eat it with the napkin over your head. All of these things may or may not be considered edible or food. You may eat them or not eat them for personal preferences or cultural reasons or biological reasons. And like I said, just because something is edible, does that make it food? When I used to teach this class in person, I had a tasting menu. So I have some suggestions on the syllabus for you of things that you could eat each week to think about topics in the course. But one of the things I used to include was easy cheese. And I would bring it in and offer the easy cheese to all the students. And very few people actually wanted to eat it. Now, this was a staple of my childhood growing up. Well, we didn't even get the brand version. But I have eaten much easy cheese in my life. But a lot of the students had no interest in eating it. So it's technically edible. But for many people, that didn't make it food. And that's why we're using the purpose of critical inquiry in this class. We will learn how to do it, we'll practice it, and ultimately the class will culminate in a project in which you investigate a recipe. And you'll use the perspective of critical inquiry to gather information and ideas from many perspectives to improve your understanding of food and a particular recipe and achieve a well-reasoned analysis of where that food came from, why you're eating it, whether you consider it to be food. Oftentimes, critical inquiry leads to new ideas and new questions, and I think that's wonderful in the world of food, new ideas, new questions. That's great. And in the process, we'll also be practicing our oral communication, mostly during your discussion sections, but we'll do as much as we can outside of those as well. So to give you an example of how we might use critical inquiry to approach the concept of food, I want you to think about the chicken. And think about all of the different perspectives that affect whether or not you would consider a chicken food. You might consider the chicken in the top picture not food, but the chicken in the bottom picture food. One is uncooked, one is cooked. And there's lots of belief systems and perception about what is food. So belief systems about eating meat. Do you eat meat? Is the meat edible? We really only eat a handful of animals. In reality, there are thousands to choose from. Many people in the US feel that they would not want to eat a horse or a dog or a rat, and these are commonly used meat sources elsewhere in the world. Oftentimes we have different language markers to determine whether an animal is alive or dead. So we talk about a cow versus beef and pigs versus pork. But on top of just these cultural belief systems and personal perceptions, we also have taboos, so social preferences about what is maybe potentially food but should not be consumed. And there's lots of taboos in the US if you think about all the different diets, keto, paleo, pregnancy diets, the MIND diet, the DASH diet, right? All of these have a variety of tabooed foods, things that could be edible that people might choose not to eat or not to eat at certain times. And beyond this, there's also what I call local ecological knowledge, or LEK, what you know about local organisms and whether you can convert them into food. So perhaps you're a hunter and you know where to find an animal to kill and how to slaughter it and cook it and prepare it into food. So local ecological knowledge includes the finding, the processing, the cooking, and the consuming of food. Not just meat, but anything that you would consume. Accessibility is another interesting facet that we'll talk about when it comes to acquiring food. So you may know and think that something is food and yet not be able to eat it because you can't get a hold of it. So I love tropical fruits, and as an anthropologist, I've lived on 4 continents. And some foods you just can't get in non-tropical countries, like really good passion fruit and those little tiny sweet bananas. Oh, so delicious. And you can buy them in the grocery store here, but it's just not the same as when they're ripened in their natural habitats. You might also have personal preferences on top of all of these systematic factors, systemic forces. You might have personal taste preferences or aversions, things that you've learned how to cook and eat growing up, or we'll talk a little bit about genetic variance in flavor and taste going forward also. So does cilantro taste soapy to you? Maybe it's not food because of your personal taste aversion. And finally, we'll talk about how all of these interact together. So there's many preferences and knowledge, beliefs, and perception of food that's determined by how these things interact with one another and how you have learned to interact with your food. So if you think about flavor, our perception of flavor, it actually results from this mental image that we fabricate in our brains, as neuroscientists have determined. So our brains combine what's happening in our mouths and our noses and our eyes and our ears as we eat. And so food is really all in our head. So if it looks like a perfect tomato and smells like a perfect tomato, it must be a perfect tomato. Now there's a little bonus video link in the Blackboard page for this lecture today if you want to check out the Colin the Chicken video from Portlandia and think about whether you would eat Colin the Chicken or not, or do you know where your chicken came from if you eat chicken. Go ahead and check out that link. But I wanted to talk a little bit, I'll give you a few examples of some case studies of how deep each one of these bullet points goes. So if you think about accessibility, what's available to us? This has really changed over the last year. What's in the grocery store? What's in stock? What's our experience with acquiring food? The picture on the left here, this is a Dutch family drinking tea in the 1600s. And they've spent a lot of money to have this picture painted of them drinking tea because they're showing off, basically, that they can drink tea, that they have access to tea. Really, coffee wasn't really available yet in Europe at this time. And the change of transportation of foods around the world has really brought so many more eating experiences to our personal tables. No, I'm showing you this picture drinking tea, but we're really going to stick to food and not drink in this class because otherwise it just opens up. There's just too much to cover as it is. So if you think about all the things, if you were to go into the grocery store today, let's say I gave you $5, what would you buy? Would you buy something differently if I gave you $100 or $1,000? So it might be there physically present, but you might not be able to personally access it. But nevertheless, on the shelves, you can see in the winter time, like now, tomatoes and kiwis and pineapples, none of which grow in temperate climates. And trading patterns have become increasingly bizarre with global economics since the 1600s. So currently, Britain imports and exports 15,000 tons of waffles coming in and out of the country. Every year, cod that's caught off Norway is shipped to China to be filleted and then shipped back to Norway again because it's cheaper to ship it to China, fillet it, and process it in China and ship it all the way back to Norway. A lot of times, weather or road conditions can make export or import and production impractical. So usually for the wealthy, any food can be had at any time if you pay the price. But for the poor, this means you probably don't. There's not as much access to food. So that means either working as cheap labor to produce the food while often experiencing food shortages due to poor transportation or high prices for imported goods. As poverty has been reduced around the world, we also see more and more people demanding more energy and more land expensive commodities like meat. So global food preferences are changing as people are relatively better off. But you can think about this in a larger scale than just what's in the grocery store right now. We're fortunate to benefit from global transportation in terms of all the different foods we can eat. If you are currently living in the US, you have the benefit of eating all of the old world plants like citrus and apples and bananas and mangoes and rice and wheat and coffee and onions. Oh, some of my favorite things. All of these have come to us from other parts of the world. And if you're not living in the US, you're fortunate to have access to corn and tomatoes and potatoes and vanilla and tobacco and chocolate and rubber. So that Dutch family drinking tea, they didn't really have access to many of these foods. Can you imagine your diet without bananas or tomatoes or potatoes or onions or coffee? And yet humans eat a relatively small range of the potential foods on Earth. So rice accounts for 20% of all calories consumed by the people on Earth today. So this Columbian exchange, trading plants between the old world and the new world, as the Columbians referred to it, has really broadened the diet and what we have access to eating. And industrialization and domestication have increased this pattern even more. So since the Neolithic Revolution about 10,000 years ago, humans have engaged in cultivating and domesticating other species, so changing the genetic makeup of those species to be produced and consumed by ourselves, so domesticating animals like cows and chickens to produce meat and milk and eggs and feathers and all sorts of things that humans like to use. And even in the last 200 to 300 years, industrialization has further changed people's expectations of food. So these CAFOs that you see here, pictures of concentrated animal feeding operations, in many ways have increased the abundance of food. So many people around the world are much more food secure than they used to be. And along with these, there's been better regulation of quality. If you've read the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair and the horrors of the meat and milk production in Chicago around late 19th century, and the reliability of getting food on the shelves. If you read historical novels, there's not expectations of round the clock, round the year food availability always. And another case study that I think is really interesting that highlights a lot of the concepts here are tomatoes. So tomatoes are the second most popular vegetable behind lettuce. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry in the US. And even though tomatoes won't grow outside in Idaho right now, we can get them all winter long but they're usually a little different from what you might grow at home in the summertime. So usually there's three varieties available in the store, these vine ripened, the Roma, and the cherry tomatoes. And they all look very similar to one another. So they're free from blemishes, similar in size, similar in shape, this uniform bright red color. And they are bred for these qualities of transportability, yield on the plant, and pest resistance. And there's actually regulations about these vine ripened tomatoes, these winter tomatoes. They have to be between 2.28 and 2.78 inches in diameter. They must be firm enough to evade bruising. They have to be picked green, not a hint of blush, so that they won't ripen before sale, and then they're usually gassed to produce the red color. They have to have this smooth, uniform silhouette. And in Florida, where most of the winter tomatoes in the U.S. are produced, growers like to have their fruits with defined shoulders and slightly flattened bottoms. Now, interestingly, out of all of these requirements that go into producing a tomato that can be brought to the grocery store and put on the shelf that you will choose, nowhere is taste mentioned as a requirement. And if you compare the nutritional value of tomatoes today versus the 1960s, you can see that they have 30% less vitamin C and thiamine, 20% less niacin, 62% less calcium, and 14 times the sodium. So interestingly, the farmers that are growing the tomatoes in Florida are selling them to retailers, and retailers are buying the ones that based on consumer preference and transportability. So the growers are not growing and breeding for consumers. And actually with tomatoes, breeding for taste is incredibly difficult because there's at least 50 genes in tomatoes that produce different compounds that affect flavors. Now, there's only one in bananas, so tomatoes have a much more complex flavor, and it's much harder to reproduce artificial tomato flavor than banana flavors. But what happens is that this is what you experience in the store, and this is what you begin to expect of a tomato, and that's how it grows into this thing that makes this tomato image in your mind. And you know that if you choose a tomato ripe off the vine in your garden in the summertime, it's quite different from one of these winter tomatoes. Now, if you think about food systems, of course, this is just a drop in the bucket, but Florida is actually a terrible place to grow tomatoes. The soil is really sandy and it lacks nutrients, so growers have to pump the soil full of chemical fertilizers and they have to irrigate. And the soil also supports a lot of pests and plant disease, which means they have to dump a ton of pesticides on the plants to make production profitable. And in fact, if you sample tomatoes in the grocery store, about half of them have detectable levels of pesticides still remaining on the surface of the tomato. And this is roughly in the middle of how much detectable pesticides are left on food. The worst are celery, peaches, strawberries, and apples. So wash your produce. But that's to say that all this effort and ecological transformation and human labor and cultural imaging go into delivering a round red fruit to you in the dead of winter. Now, there's been a movement to relax visual standards for fruits and veggies. It's called ugly produce. You might have heard of it. And this allows misshapen items to be sold, either put on the shelves at all, or to be sold at a reduced cost. And to many people, the taste, quality, and origin of their food is becoming increasingly important. And that might be one of the reasons why you're taking this class, is because you're interested in that. So we dropped the cucumber curve norm, the curvature that cucumbers need to follow in 2008. But there's still regulations like a zucchini has to be 7 centimeters long and free of cavities and splits. So one of the things you'll do in this class for your final project, the signature assignment, is to track an ingredient in that recipe that you'll make and think about, okay, I'm cooking a pasta sauce in the middle of winter, using tomatoes from scratch. Where did these tomatoes come from? How did they get to me? What went into producing them and transporting them and putting them on the shelves and going into my cultural expectations of which one I picked and how, and all these awesome things that it's so fun to think about. I'm going to talk a lot about perception because it's where biology and culture and behavior kind of meet in the middle. because our beliefs and values and access to food knowledge, preferences all go into perception, the perception affecting what is food. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit more of a cultural exploration of what we think of as food. And I want you to think about how what we consider to be food might vary by something like the time of day, or the season, or the social occasion, or the cultural milieu. Our appetite for different things changes throughout the day, and it's both culturally and biologically bound. So think about what you might eat for breakfast. It can be sweet or savory, but it probably varies by the day of the week. There's weekend breakfast foods and weekday breakfast foods. There's certain combinations of sweet and savory that you might prefer, like syrup on pancakes or syrup with sausages. But there's combinations that we don't think are right of sweet and savory. So when I was living in India, I had a research assistant working with me, a local Indian man, and I would make pancakes on Sunday because I had to have a break from curry. And I I was living in South India, and you eat curry for breakfast there. And I just couldn't take it. And one day a week, I needed my pancakes, and it was really weird to this research assistant that I would eat basically what's dessert in the morning. So really not too many sweets, and those are saved for dessert. So he would do his best to make pancakes like curry for breakfast, and he would put ketchup all over his pancakes. Now, maybe you eat ketchup for pancakes, but for me, I found that not very attractive as a food. um, because we're culture bound in the ways of what we consider food to be, our perception of food. Breakfast can be hot or cold. It might vary by season. You might eat different breakfasts in the summer versus the winter. And it might vary by who you eat with. So a social breakfast like lunch is usually much less healthy than a solitary breakfast. And it might vary by the circumstances you find yourself in. What country are you living in right now? Whose house are you in? What's in your fridge? Did you get paid recently? All of these things can affect what you eat for breakfast. And you can think about how food changes over the course of the day by comparing breakfast to lunch. Would you eat a turkey sandwich at 8 a.m. in the morning? Now, you might eat it, but you probably would not prefer to have a sandwich for breakfast. And what's more, a lot of lunch foods are made to be portable due to a cultural history of agricultural labor in the U.S. People don't so often bring, sack breakfasts or sack dinners. Not that it's not done, but it's just less expected. But lunch is almost always savory, and it can be eaten cold like sandwiches, also hot. It's usually middle size between breakfast and dinner. People usually eat small, middle, large meals throughout the day. Of course, this is just our cultural preference. It can go the other way too. And it's rare to eat foods thought of for other meals for lunch. So pancakes for lunch, you might call that brunch instead of lunch, even if you eat it at noon. People are more likely to eat breakfast for dinner than breakfast for lunch. So lunch is usually kind of its own category. Now, of course, you know where I'm going with this. Would you eat a turkey dinner for breakfast? Maybe not. Would you eat it at lunchtime? Maybe a couple days of the year on a special holiday. Dinner is usually the biggest meal of the day and the most social. And it's culturally prescribed, just like the others in the U.S. Culturally standard dinner meal is a tripartite meal consisting of, as you see on this plate, a starch, a vegetable, and a meat. This is what my Midwestern mother fed me growing up, 3-part meal. Potatoes, usually canned green beans, and some chicken, hamburger helper, something like that. But you probably wouldn't eat this for breakfast early in the morning. And you might expect a fancier, larger, more effortful prepared meal on a holiday, or maybe a social family dinner or a date dinner or something a little out of the ordinary. dinner with the expectation of brunch, if you consider brunch a meal. I have young kids, so I don't get to eat brunch anymore. But dinner is usually the only meal that you get to drink with. Sometimes you might have mimosas or a lunch beer if that's your thing. But dinner usually can, common to have a glass of wine or beer with dinner for the adults and milk for the children. And this is mostly not because kids necessarily to drink milk. And in fact, most of the world, people can't digest milk after the age of 3. A lot of humans are lactose intolerant in adulthood. But it's common, the idea of having a glass of milk was really made standard by the milk industry, lobbying and advertising for these 3 glasses of milk a day. So our perception of what is food affects what we eat and when and seasonally and socially and even how these things are eaten. So you probably wouldn't eat a sandwich with a fork and a knife, for example. Okay, so I just wanted to conclude this little kind of tour of some of the fun topics we get to talk about in here, and to give you this bigger perspective of how we think about biology and culture and history all interacting to make up what goes into our bowl of ramen or on our banana leaf or in our tagine or on our plates. We're going to use this perspective of critical inquiry to combine all these 3 things to answer the question, what is food? Along the way, we'll get to do a lot of interesting anthropology, looking at cultural and biological variation in cooking and eating. And I hope you'll enjoy eating along with the tasting menu and reading along with the course textbook, 8 Flavors, which explores the variation and cultural history of why we eat what we do. Okay, see you next time. Bye.